Yeah, formalization is anti-poverty policy. I think that's maybe one of the more controversial things I say in the book, right? Because the idea of inclusion as being the thing that you have to do in order to kind of fight poverty, that's really pervasive. And I kind of agree with that impulse, but there's again, kind of in line with this idea that nothing is happening in a tabula rasa space. These formalization policies aren't just about kind of an inclusion in some kind of abstract state, right? But can really be interpreted as exceptionally as partisan and political. And when you're trying to include people, you have to be really attentive to how you're including them. What are the categories in terms of that inclusion? Because that matters for how people are going to experience marginality.
Hi, this is Emily Holloway, and you're listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. You just heard from Dr. Kristin Skrabut, the author of Unruly Domestication, Poverty, Family, and Statecraft in Urban Peru from University of Texas Press.
My name is Kristin Skrabut. I am a cultural anthropologist and assistant professor of urban and environmental policy at Tufts University. My research focuses on statecraft, kinship, and urban space in Latin America, and primarily in Lima, where I've spent the last so much time, like 15 years of my life conducting research, specifically in a community at the northwestern periphery of Lima known as Pachacutec.
Great. And Kristin, thanks so much for joining us today. Maybe to get started, if you could tell us a bit about how you came to this project. Why Peru?
Well, so I actually started out as an archaeologist, not an anthropologist, or an aspiring archaeologist. And that's how I first found my way to Peru, because that's where all the ruins are, right? It's got amazing preservation conditions. And then when I decided I wanted to move into anthropology and study los vivos y no los muertos, right? The living and not the dead, which Peruvians always find hilarious when I say, because vivos means like wily and sneaky and like trying to take advantage of the government too. So when I decided to do that, to move into that space, I wanted to go back to Peru.
Oh, that's interesting. So early on, you frame your book's opening with Peru's national census to launch into your discussions around not just poverty as a social issue or condition, but how it's produced through numbers, statistics, statecraft. Can you talk about that a bit?
I first started this in 2007. And at the time, I was really interested in identity politics and statecraft. And at that moment, the Peruvian state was just going to be doing its second national census in 2 years. And it was redoing the census entirely because the recently elected president had said that the former census didn't adequately count the population, and we're going to do a new one that freezes everybody in place. So everyone had to stay in their houses from, 8 to 6 p.m. one day, so that people could go around and just count everybody, which is a very old school way to do a census. It feels it's very politically visible, feels very draconian, but there was definitely this visibility politics that was going on when Peru was doing the census. But my interest in it was that, so in addition to this being the second census in 2 years, they were going to try and capture an ethnic identity category. And so I was really interested in how Indigenous roots are going to respond to this identity category. So I identify a place where I think there are going to be migrants, and these sites called invasiones very often, or pueblos jóvenes, invasions or young towns. Archaeologist friends said, that's where all the migrants are, go there. And I found a place where people were willing to speak with me and interested in having an anthropologist work with them. And so I started trying to get into to understand Indigenous identity, and I fairly quickly realized that no one gives a damn about Indigenous identity. That's not the thing that no one cares about. What they care about, right, in terms of identity, the way identity plays out in the everyday, which if you're trying to do this methodologically, you pay attention to us and them, right? Where does us and them emerge in everyday conversation? And in this space, it was the people who are really living in this area and the people who are just kind of living or pretending to live, or the tourists, right? So it was really, identity politics was really residential politics and the politics of inhabitants. So that was the first project I did, was on it's kind of informal modalities for urbanization, and what constitutes kind of real residency and real inhabitants, and how this relates to state practices of accounting. So as I was trying to develop broader dissertation project, or as I was doing that first research on informal urbanization, I started to notice that every policy that I encountered, that I heard about, was everything the government did was always justified in terms of the war on poverty. Right, everything was about the lucha contra la pobreza, whether it was the war on drugs, citizen security, distributing ID cards, food. We have to fight the war on drugs because we have to fix poverty. So I started to become really curious about, well, what are people talking about when they're talking about poverty? What does this mean to people? Oh, and at the same time, so as every policy is being explained in terms of the war on poverty, Peru is also trumpeting these statistics about how their poverty rate is plummeting, right? It's gone from approximately 50% in the year 2000, right? So half of the population is designated as poor, over half, to about 20% in 10 years, which is extraordinary. And yet every time this poverty statistic came out, there was always this sort of flurry of contestation, newspapers, pundits, and people I worked with in Pachacutec who would tell me, you can't believe that, those stats are being rigged, that's just statistical smoke, right? How do we make sense of this disjuncture between these official statistics, right, and the political salience of poverty, and the ways in which it seems to be understood and experienced in practice?
Yeah, the production of statistics is such a fascinating perspective, not just on the creation of these social categories like class, ethnicity, gender, but it's also a window into the state.
So the term statistics, my understanding is that statistics are the science of the state, right? And, in the 20th century, the legitimacy of the state is really dependent on its ability to produce statistics to count the population, right? Statistics only matter in the context of trying to manage a population, right? And the only entity that tries to manage a population is a state, right, or some kind of state-like entity. I guess beginning back in the 1930s, Peruvian politicians, with the rise of modernity in Peru, Peruvian politicians really start to stake their reputation on understanding the science of population and being able to produce sound statistics. So in that context, where the legitimacy of the state is grounded in statistics, right? To challenge the state's numbers is to challenge the legitimacy of the state, and you saw this very explicitly with that case of Toledo and the 2005 versus the 2007 census. So the 2005 census was under Alejandro Toledo, and he tried to do the census in terms of kind of the most internationally accepted ways of doing a census, which is not with a de facto census where you freeze everybody, but rather it's done over the course of a number of weeks. There's some survey estimates that go into it, so you don't have to disrupt everyday life. And he really did try and do it in accordance with best practices in the United States and in France. Right. But it's an invisible political technique. No one really sees it, doesn't disrupt anything. And when those statistics came out, interestingly, it seemed like that census had undercounted the population, right? Based in comparison to what you would have projected. So Alan Garcia took this as a way of saying, hey, this government didn't know what they were doing. We are going to take a new census that really counts everybody, and we're going to make sure we do it right by freezing everybody and walking around and counting everybody. And so this space where you see someone taking the administrative responsibilities of the state and embracing it in this really populist way, in this really, really performative way. But then, so after he does that, right, so he critiques Toledo and says, okay, I'm challenging your statistics and your government by saying you weren't able to do these statistics right. So then Garcia goes ahead and does this, and then people who want to contest Garcia start saying, okay, well, that's not the most modern way to do it. And now, because you're counting things in a different way in accordance with how your administration wants to govern, we're not able to do these comparative statistics. And people started to suggest that by doing a new census and doing a new kind of baseline, Garcia would be able to rig all statistics going forward. So that's a baseline for how challenging statistics is a kind of political tactic.
So maybe to segue from this analytic into the book itself, where you're actually looking at this relationship between state power, this war on poverty, to the actual experiences of residents who are technically categorized as impoverished, how those state actions change or don't change people's lives in meaningful ways. I mean, you're an anthropologist. You're conducting ethnographic work on the ground in Lima in these communities. So, how do these connect or not connect? In other words, what's the gap between institutional or state policies to combat poverty and then people's actual lived experiences of both poverty and those efforts to diminish it?
The way I divide up the book and thinking about, what the war on poverty consists of in Peru. So you begin with trying to understand what poverty is. We've got how poverty is conceptualized, right? How anti-poverty policies are implemented, and then how poverty comes to be experienced, right? So that's the third section of the book. So in this first section where I talk about concepts in situ. So thinking about what is poverty, right? And for all of these different places and anywhere you go, right, you're never going to get it right. If you go to policy design organizations in Lima, they've got the numbers, they're manipulating statistics, but they seem so distant from it, right? So on some level, they've got, because they have this statistical expertise, they have some kind of claim to truth, but that claim to truth can be challenged because they don't. How do you know? You're not there. You're not on the ground. Plus, any information that they're getting, it's always filtered through categories, right? It's always filtered through. It's these kind of one-dimensional, whatever it is the state is interested in at that time. You could maybe critique the particular things that they're taking note of, right? So yeah, and with that, and when you're doing that kind of analysis, I think I maybe took this line out of the book, but I talk about constructing these national averages of poverty as kind of constructing a kind of statistical Frankenstein's monster, right? Because you kind of construct these aggregate facts. A fairly accessible example is, the average family has 2.1 kids. No, they don't. There's no family that has 2.1 kids. That represents no one's experience. It's a useful indicator for governance, right? But it's not capturing experience. Yeah, so that's one way of understanding poverty. And then you've got the kind of grounded understanding of poverty, making their lives in these extreme poverty zones, but they almost always talk about themselves in a way that's kind of distant from poverty, right? Like very few people embrace the poverty label. It's a technique of negotiation. It's something that comes up once in a while, but it's not, the poverty categories, no one thinks of themselves as primarily poor, right? They think of themselves in relation to a whole bunch of other different categories that matter. One of the techniques I did was I actually shadowed some of the surveyors, right, to try and understand some of these poverty surveyors, or the National Survey of Household and Life Conditions, to try and understand how conditions on the ground in Pachacutec were being captured. There's this respondent that we have to interview. That organization's had to interview him 4 years in a row. And he's, by all accounts, he has no family. His original house had been flooded, so he was relocated to Pachacutec. He's got, really, he works as like a shop assistant in a local convenience store. He doesn't have much in the way of income to speak of. So he seems like someone who you just think is poor, like who might embrace that label. But as we were talking, he just got so frustrated with all the questions, and he was like, "Why are you all talking to me? So much poverty that one sees around here. Look around you. Look at all this poverty. Why aren't you talking to those poor people? Right? The problem with the government is you don't have a way to channel resources. Right? Stop talking to me and talk to the truly needy." Right? So poverty always seemed to be kind of elsewhere. Anytime you scrutinize any particular case too carefully, people would find a reason to doubt that particular case of poverty, right? So poverty is this construct. Its greatest salience in some ways, or its greatest realities in the abstract, right? It never exists as a real case. Like poverty is, like, you can be a poor person, right? But poverty only exists in the abstract, in the way. So the state and people and NGOs and folks who are trying to assist are in some ways they're seeking out poverty, but that kind of abstract poverty doesn't exist in the ground. What exists are people who are poor in different ways.
So, do you think of poverty as a kind of social relation? How is it mediated by these other practices or state actions and technologies?
So in this case, you can think of poverty as a relation, right? And certainly, I think structures of inequality in some ways shape people's experience in a very real way, in a way I think that policymakers should be. I kind of think policymakers should be attacking those structures of inequality more so than attacking some kind of abstract, often spatialized poverty. But the way I talk about in that section, concepts in situ, the way I talk about poverty is that, everyone's trying to understand this abstract concept, but it only ever materializes in very particular ways. I describe it as an assemblage, right? Or using this kind of global assemblage framework. So you've got these statistics and these kind of, you have these statistical frameworks, but you also have Peru's kind of very living history of inequality and indigeneity and colonization and corrupt politicians. And then you have your own experiences of engaging with state institutions. And then you have the representational resources, right? So like I can sit here and tell you that like, oh, poverty is, very hard to pin down. If you're in Peru and you're constantly seeing someone point to, hey, these are the statistics that define it. Here's this reality TV show, Extreme Lives, where we're going to go out and showcase the poorest of the poor. Then suddenly that imaginary becomes part of this assemblage, right? It becomes part of how you understand what quote unquote real poverty is. And one of my big critiques of it, like, so that show Extreme Lives, that the imaginary of poverty that they produce is so extraordinary and so morally clean, right? So pristine, so impossible, right? That no one could ever possibly inhabit, no real person could possibly inhabit that category. And as a result of trumpeting this very precise image, together with a whole bunch of statistical language that makes us think that image does exist somewhere. We know because 20% of the Peruvian population is that, right? So you've got these statistics combining these imaginaries. So people think that there's this impossibly precise understanding of poverty that exists. And that makes it very easy to deny people aid and to say that nobody is ever deserving. One of my points is we have to be really careful with how we're representing poverty because it matters, right? And if we could find a way to represent deservingness that was broader, right, that didn't focus on kind of these pornographic displays of suffering or really trying to appeal to people's sympathies, try to come up with portrayals that recognize that people are imperfect and multidimensional and they are still worthy of aid because it is a worthwhile pursuit to make sure that everyone can live their best life.
Talking to anthropologists and sociologists who work in urban studies is always really interesting because these disciplines really rely on ethnographic fieldwork. You're embedded in your research area, and as a result, you have to adapt so much to changing circumstances. I don't even just mean intellectually, like when a comment from or an observation of a research subject totally changes your questions, although that happens sometimes too, but you're also adapting to the material conditions of the area. What was that like your experiences in the field for this book?
Yeah, the adaptation process is constant, right? Like one of the great things about ethnography is it's so adaptive. You kind of you deal with what's there. You adjust the questions based on what's there. So I was interested in state programs and interactions between Pachacutanos and the state. Like when you actually try and identify the state, it's like it's a whole bunch of different people and institutions, and it's not really clear. It's sort of like poverty, right? It kind of dissipates as you try and get close to it. But at the time when I started my field work, there was a fairly clear administrative center of Pachacutec. It was the first 3 concrete buildings. Right? So in starting my fieldwork every morning, I was living about 5 kilometers away from Pachacutec. Eventually I moved into Pachacutec, but either way, I, walk or take a combi to this administrative center of Pachacutec, which housed the Civic Center, which was donated by President Alejandro Toledo. It has the this kind of what's called the agencia, where the municipal government operates, and then this vacant model home. Ministry of Housing was aspiring to build in Pachacutec, but kind of never did because no one liked the design. Anywho, so yeah, this kind of monument to failed state plans. But every morning I kind of go to this area and I hang out and try and figure out what's happening that day. And if you hang out long enough, you make friends. Essentially, when I first arrived in Pachacutec, the first person I met who was like, oh yes, we really want to work with an anthropologist, he warned me. He's like, come to, he's hung out in the Civic Center. He was the administrator there. And he's like, yeah, I'm happy to help you with your project. I'd love to work with you. But just so you know, I don't want you to, there are a whole bunch of bad dirigentes, bad community leaders who are really just hurting Pachacutec. You shouldn't talk to those guys. Only talk to people that I introduce you to. So like, oh, well, okay, that's interesting, right? Like note to self, a little wary. And then kind of stumbled into the agencia and I saw there was a meeting of dirigentes going on, like these not only bad dirigentes. And to the people who were leading that, they were essentially saying that the leadership structure that my first contact was involved with had overstayed their term and they didn't actually represent the community. These dirigentes really represent the community, right? And so then both these sides had this strange interest in kind of communicating their side to me and why they were the legitimate leadership here. So, but through that experience, I end up kind of making friends with a lot of the leadership in who's trying to kind of oust this original now non-representative leadership structure. And then over time, a lot of those leaders get absorbed into the municipal government. So because I already had these contacts and these relationships, they understood who I was, understood kind of my student-ly project to just understand everyday life in Pachacutec. And they were okay with me shadowing a lot of the political work they're doing, a lot of the policy work that they were doing. So I every time there's some people would contact me when there's a community event, say, oh, you might want to come and take pictures for us. And so I would do that. And I would also work with lower level government employees as they kind of made rounds and tried to enact policy. And through that, you end up encountering even more community leaders, and I explain my project to them. And through that, I was able to get a good sense of what the internal operations of the state were. And also, trying to distance myself from that organization, I was able to kind of make friends with other kinds of community leaders and then start shadowing them in their mutual aid programs and practices. Those first few months of field work, I'm trying to figure out who's the real representation here, who are the legitimate leaders. There's an earthquake, and it's 2007, and I remember being outside I was outside the agencia, and I just remember feeling like I was surfing all of a sudden and not knowing what was happening. All the dogs bark, and then you feel the earth kind of undulate, and then women screaming for patron saints, running home very quickly, and community leaders jumping in their cars and not saying anything, right? And me just standing there, not really knowing what was going on. And then I'm able to make my way back to my house. But the next day I come back, and it turns out the earthquake, it was registered 7.9 on the Richter scale, which is big. But I realized that it comes out that the epicenter is in this town called Pisco, and that's where most of the damage is. They have these very iconic churches there that completely collapsed. And in Pachacutec, while things were scary, because most of the houses are made of straw, right? There wasn't much to get damaged. And I remember this one woman kind of embarrassingly talking about how she got home, she realized her kids were okay, and the first thing she did was throw herself in front of the TV, because that was the asset that she had that could break, right? And that represents so much work and so much labor, and she's probably still paying it off anyway. But then everyone in Pachacutec, who I'm understanding as being the poorest of the poor, the truly needy, because it is an officially designated extreme poverty zone. But all of a sudden, all those people start taking up collections to send down to Pisco. And all the politicians who were trying to showcase their earnest concern for Pachacutanos start going to Pisco to be seen helping there. Right. So at that moment, as I'm starting to think about poverty, I also decide to I also go down to Pisco. Okay, well, what's going on here? Right. And that's when I come to realize that poverty is mobile. Right. It doesn't stay in place. So in some sense, poverty is this thing that it's a production, right? You need cameras, you need images, you need laws, and that kind of produces some emergency circumstance that makes people care. Right. So from that, I kind of, my methodology in terms of thinking about the scope of this project, it sort of evolves, right? And I start trying to figure out, okay, well, Pachacutec is the place where the poorest of the poor are, except in certain circumstances, right? So then I try and understand, okay, well, where are these other places? And I go to other places outside of Lima, other places more broadly in Peru that are designated as extreme poverty zones to try and understand how they are similar to or different from, right? And so then I go and spend a few days, a few weeks. In the case of Pisco, I lived there for 4 months trying to understand those dynamics. And so I had aspirations at one point for this to be a truly comparative project. Let me hold Pisco constant and let me hold Pachacutec constant and compare them. But I sort of realized, because I've continued to return to Pachacutec over and over, I realized that really the center of my theory building is there, right? That's how I understand what everyday life is in Peru, is through this site, and everything else is kind of a way for me to better understand what's happening here. So in the book, I talk about that as a grounded but mobile methodology.
I think there's so much in here in terms of methods, theory that could be portable, even though your work is really grounded in place or in situ, as you say. But what do you hope that readers will take away from this book? Do you see it crossing disciplinary lines, maybe even informing some of the more practical, policy-oriented work in Latin American cities?
So I mean, I think the book can speak to certainly urban scholars and Latin Americanists, people interested in Peru, and in fact, I know that Peruvians are already picking up this book in a way that, for like, urban planners in Peru are picking up my book in a way that I think is just amazing, and it's bolstering my confidence that I actually got something real. Yeah, that can be a fear, right? Oh, am I really getting this right? But the fact that Peruvians and people who work in these places are picking it up and saying, yeah, you did, and we want to kind of work with this to produce policy, and produce better urban spaces and understand urban spaces better. That's, yeah, been really gratifying for me. I would really love it if IR students, people interested in developments, any kind of social policy or any kind of do-gooder work, right? I would really love it if that population picked up the book, because I think one of the things that I was so struck by reading through policy texts, and particularly a lot of the formalization programs that are used to combat poverty, so many of those formalization programs, like programs to formalize identity and formalize property, a lot of that is based on this weird idea that this program is the first thing that has ever happened to this place. And they really do. They reproduce these tabula rasa imaginaries, and that's not, and as a result, policies misfire or not interpreted the way the people who are enacting the policies want them to be interpreted, because they don't recognize that whatever they're doing is going to be layered into this really complex sociopolitical space. And so I think that's one big takeaway, right? That people need in some ways it's very simple, right? But that anyone who wants to do policy has to have a really good understanding of what is already there politically, and socially before you enact, because otherwise you have no way of knowing what your policy is going to do or how it's going to be perceived.
Now, we haven't really had the opportunity to get into it too much yet, but gender is also a really significant motif throughout this work. How poverty is experienced differently along gendered lines, how notions of family, kinship, or domesticity can get entangled not only in the experiences of poverty, but also how it's defined or treated as a problem for the state.
So gender is a big theme in the book, and that was one of the more unexpected themes. This construct of single mothers was so omnipresent in discourses on poverty. And it's particularly important nowadays because there's a lot of development programs focused on empowering women. And one of the things that I hope comes across in the book is that there's a kind of tension there, right? So between empowerment and responsibilization. Right. So a lot of these efforts to empower women and get them to take ownership over their lives, it's putting an extraordinary burden on women and also holding them in some ways to a really impossible standard, such that they end up being sort of trapped by these representations of what is the entrepreneurial, good, deserving, poor woman. And so I would love it if the book encourages people to be more sensitive to that slippage and helps us pull back before that happens.
My thanks to Kristin Skrabut, author of Unruly Domestication from University of Texas Press. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. You've been listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by Urban Affairs Review. Special thanks to Drexel University and the editors at UAR. Music is by Blue Dot Sessions. This show was mixed and produced by Aidan McLaughlin and written and produced by me, Emily Holloway. You can find us on Blue Sky at urbanaffairsreview.bluesky.social for updates on the journal and the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.